Ayres from the War College, I believe. Take the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having us here. This is a great opportunity. I just want to let you know that there are several studies that are not necessarily mentioned in the smaller book that Frank and Peter had found earlier, some of which are interesting in respect to how they go about a slightly different problem, and that's mostly cyber, but it's still very similar, and it actually still is very appropriate to our issue today. And in this regard, I'm looking at worst case. A lot of people have a problem with saying worst case, but this is really what people perceive when they hear about this particular issue, when they hear about an EMP threat or a CME, or even a cyber threat. Many people don't think that'll ever happen here. So this is where I'm coming from on this. Oops. And I always have to use this disclaimer because I spent 38 and a half years at the National Security Agency and would appreciate the tomatoes thrown at me here. But anyway, the ideas and opinions that are shown in this particular briefing are mine and not that of NSA or CIA or any other agency that I work with, and not at the Army War College either. We've talked about man-made disasters and CMEs from the sun. We talked a little bit about digital disasters. We have, over the past couple of weeks, focused on emergency managers who would find themselves in the front lines of this particular war, as would individuals. Because, as we've already discussed, there aren't going to be a lot of people coming to our aid, unfortunately. Why am I looking at worst case? Well, worst case does happen. As you can remember, there have been several worst case scenarios recently, not anywhere near to the kind, to the massive kind of worst case that we're looking at, but there have been worst case scenarios, and they're not impossible. According to this particular Zogby poll, only one American in four is concerned with anything really happening to their particular community, any kind of disaster whatsoever. So, and they actually see the U.S. as invincible. I hear this all the time in regard to the military. We've got the biggest military, we've got the best trained military. We'll never have the kind of problems that we see in other countries. But we do, and we will, and this is how our adversaries see us. They see us as very vulnerable, unfortunately. These are the threats, essentially, from a high-altitude or non-nuclear EMP. We're seeing the same kinds of actors, and we're not just talking about the countries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, as we've already mentioned, Venezuela also. But we're looking at terrorists and drug lords, human smugglers even, and various other criminal elements. And if you note, in the cyber warfare list, they're the same people, the same actors. And actually, we would probably see a combination, if we were attacked in this way, we'd probably see a combination of a cyber attack followed by an EMP attack. And as has been noted, the cyber doctrine of our enemies includes an EMP attack. So, we used to be prepared. Our families used to can food. We had relatives that we could go to talk about how to be prepared for a long-term electrical outage. We used to be prepared for all kinds of things. In the Cold War, we used to be prepared to have a missile attack, for instance. So what's changed? Again, we used to be prepared. The bad guys used to be able to rob a bank one bank at a time. And we were prepared for that. Now, with a digital attack, all kinds of banks, many banks, maybe all banks, could be robbed at the same time. We used to be prepared for the Cold War worry, which was specific to potential nuclear exchange, that is, nuclear warheads falling on cities. And that would be devastating, especially considering the kinds of the numbers that we were talking about during the Cold War. But now, a first strike surprise using one nuclear weapon could help take down the world, take down the U.S. certainly, as an actor on the world stage, instantaneously and long term. instantaneously and long-term. 4 to 10 years, probably. Again, alternatively, the sun could take us out in a similar manner. So, unfortunately, we cannot turn back time. However much I want to pitch my laptop and my phone into the river, I can't do it, unfortunately. But we, as a military, we as a nation, we've trained, we have built our businesses around technology. And the military is now in the process, in many cases, not the entire military, of relearning how to do things the old way, using grease pencils and boards, chalkboards at that. It's very difficult for some of the younger folks especially, but it's the only way that we know how to prepare our military for a world without electricity. Can we turn back time? Unfortunately, we have established all kinds of risk with technology. Risk and risk management have become our enemy. And unfortunately, the dangers are greater. The dangers are greater, but our perception, our belief in the likelihood of these dangers occurring has diminished. Risk management is kind of a concept that's taken its place. We have been relying on risk management practices as almost a religion. We've become so ensconced in risk management and business logic that we have forgotten to include worst case scenarios, or we totally dismiss the idea of a worst case scenario. It's the topic of a paper that Brookings has just done very recently called Bound to Fail. And there's so many things in this particular study, I recommend it highly, that are absolutely pertinent to the EMP issue as well as the cyber issue. That by using risk management, we are arguing away the possibility of these things happening. For critical management, it says specifically, for critical infrastructure protection, risk management is a recipe for failure. Our adversaries are real. They are testing, as you've already heard, they're testing these delivery systems, both digital and kinetic, and the worst case does happen. Industry, unfortunately, is more concerned at the moment with risk management due to the fact that they are industry than with national survival because, as we've heard, national security is seen as something the federal government does, not business, not industry. And we can understand that, but we need to become more worried about our national survival. We need to become more worried, as individuals even, about national security. Every individual in the country needs to start being concerned with national security. I bring this up because this comes as a shock to some people. There are 2 Chinese colonels who've written about total war against the United States. This book called Unrestricted Warfare cites 12 different ways of taking down the United States that can be used in conjunction with each other or one at a time, or just one step. EMP is included. You've seen this. It actually, on some certain days, takes us over Missouri. And if you had a nuclear warhead 300 miles above Missouri, it would take out the entire continent. North Korean propaganda film was rather scary to be seen in this North Korean film. You may have remembered that there was what seemed to be a missile launched off the southern coast of California. I believe it was a couple of years ago now. It was seen actually by Vice Admiral Monroe as a missile. It went into the ocean, but it's still being debated as to what exactly that was. A few days later, there was one off the coast of New York, and then a few weeks later, there was one down by the coast of Texas, off the coast of Texas. All of them went into the ocean, and they all kind of went unnoticed, with the exception of the one off the coast of Southern California. Now, even if you don't buy into the fact that these might have been missiles, there couldn't have been 3 better places for these missiles to have been launched, especially coming from an ocean location, and considering the height that they would have reached. It would take down all 3 sectors of the grid, as you can see. I have a little bit of sound effects here left. Hope I didn't blow out anybody's ears. Okay, so a cyber trigger is the question of the day right now. The UK and Israel have both reported cyber threats to the grid within the past year, and we, while I wondered, are we next? We have already been hit many times. As Frank has reported, there was a very recent hit in Connecticut, and it was very worrying. But we're being hit constantly, and the cyber threat is becoming more and more dangerous. Every day, every hour, actually. The Secretary of Defense, SecDef, had warned of a cyber Pearl Harbor, and it's become much, again, the threat is much worse since he has actually stated that. He specifically talked about critical infrastructure networks. And this is important because up to this point, nobody had really discussed this in public. Secretary of Homeland Security, had also talked about attacks on the power plant. And again, this was happening approximately the same time as SecDef came out with his comments. But they are both talking about devastating attacks on critical infrastructure, to the point where we would have our electricity taken down long term. The president himself was talking about the same thing. And in the PPD that he put out in the unclassified realm was discussing similar results of a catastrophic attack on the grid. EMP is included in the enemy's cyber doctrine. I want to reinforce that notion. EMP is considered in the cyber doctrine of our enemies. SecDef had stated if a cyber attack crippled the power grid, it would essentially constitute an act of war. And think about that, an act of war. Now, unfortunately, because cyber is such it's an odd animal in military doctrine, we're still talking about what is an act of war in the cyber realm. We have no idea, really. As a matter of fact, the Army War College is going to be looking at that in September, but we don't know that we can come up with an answer. When would we consider retaliation? Even if this was considered an act of war, if the recent attack in Connecticut was considered an act of war, have we thought about retaliating? We certainly wouldn't be talking about it in the unclassified world, but one would think that we would if it was an act of war. If it was a real act of war, we would know about it, right? Should we ever consider preemptive strikes? And by preemptive strikes, perhaps we're talking about an EMP attack against another country. If we knew that they were going to do it to us, would we do it to them first? These are all questions we're looking at. Now, why is this such a big deal? Besides the fact that you'd be without electricity, this is a big problem. 100 of the 104 nuclear power plants in the United States are located in the East Coast, on the eastern half of the United States. Unfortunately, the spent fuel rod pools that are associated with these nuclear power plants are not well protected, and they would go to Chernobyl approximately 8 to 22 days, 21 days after a power outage. Because there are many regulations that exist as to how long you can keep, say, diesel fuel generators and such, but they are not prepared to cool these spent fuel rod pools long term. This is a terrifying aspect of the problem. This is Fukushima post tsunami, and it's just a very small problem compared to what we could be seeing in a post EMP world. So if we were attacked, if our enemies actually did succeed in attacking us, what would we expect in a post EMP environment? Would our adversaries wait around? Would they quit at that point? Would they immediately initiate operations to take over if it was an attack? Who would they target first if that were the case, and where would they come from? Unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of domestic adversarial activity. Some of it is associated with organized crime, human smugglers, but quite a bit of it, and the scariest part, is terror cells. We know Hezbollah, Hamas, the IRGC, and MS-13, and many other gangs, as well as other terrorist organizations, are located within the United States waiting. Now, This is an old map. It's a very old map. It's like 2007, 2008. It's very, very, it's a bigger problem, let's put it that way. There's a great deal more activity than you would see on this map. This is another manner of exploring the activity, but again, those are all old maps. This kind of attack is favored. This is an abbreviated version of my bigger brief, by the way, so if it's a bit choppy, please forgive me and please ask questions later. If such an attack were to occur, it's because it is the favored option of our adversaries. And why wouldn't it be? It would take the United States down immediately. It would take us out of the world, on the world stage, and we would not be able to respond. We would not be able to help our allies. And our allies would probably not want to help us, especially if it were an attack, and especially if they were attacked. They would not be able to. It's the weapon of choice. It takes out everything. It takes out the military, it takes out the emergency responders, it takes out individuals, it takes out everything. I initially, after going to the 2009 Niagara Falls briefing conference, after the release of the report by the EMP Commission, I went to our leadership at the Army War College and asked them essentially why we weren't looking at this problem. It was an interesting answer, and not one that I really wanted to hear, but really what we got out of it was the military facilities in the United States are dependent on our communities, on the surrounding communities. They're not only dependent on surrounding communities, but we are almost placed in the exact same manner in terms of resources. We have about 3 days worth of food. We probably wouldn't have enough weapons to go around, and the people who live on the military bases are pretty much a few of those who are stationed there. The others live in the community. Would they be able to even get onto the military post afterward? Maybe not. Some of them live 2 hours away. So what can we do? We can request immediate action at all levels, which we're trying to do through the states, through the emergency responders, through and at the federal levels. We can encourage community resiliency, which is another aspect of this issue, and we can encourage individual preparedness. Someone initially said that if we could actually get everybody to be prepared to the extent that they could for a year-long outage, then we would greatly enhance our survival, and I believe that to be true. If we can do it with everybody, that's hard to do. Emergency managers, again, could find themselves in the front line, and this was directed to our emergency managers at Erie, which I just came from a conference at, so I'm afraid I didn't get that taken care of on that slide. This is a nightmare scenario. It's not really intended to scare you to death, but I think it's feasible. The people that I've run across in the military think it's feasible, specifically Major General Newman, who was the Adjutant General of Virginia, believes it to be feasible. It was published in this volume. It was a DNI publication several years ago, actually 2007. This is an abbreviated version, and it was originally written with regard to Ahmadinejad, who, when he was first elected, if you will, he seemed to be talking about an EMP attack against the United States. Frank brought up some of the slides that have been filtered throughout the United States that show that he really was considering something new. So how do you take down the Western world quickly? I think you can do it in less than an hour. As a matter of fact, this particular scenario, you can do it in 30 minutes or less. I started it off December 25th mainly because that would be the time period when few people would be ready or willing to respond, and people would be more willing to accept a power outage as just an accident or something they really don't. It's not part of their day at the time, at that particular point in time. And if we did it at midnight Eastern Standard Time, that would pretty much cover the entire continent at the best possible time. So 2 explosions in this particular scenario. I used 2 just to make sure that's redundant. As we have already stated, it would work with 1 above the center of the continent. and the lights go out. We have a few explosions, conventional or perhaps a 1 kiloton nuclear base. Maybe a little bit more, but in the ports of Hawaii, you would probably take them out for a long enough period of time to be effective. And then in England, you could probably get the airports in London, maybe Edinburgh, Glasgow, or the north of England, and you'd probably take care of England for a while. Israel, unfortunately, it would only take one with Israel. I put two because you probably want to hit Dimona and Tel Aviv. Jerusalem's an interesting issue, though, because in Islamic apocalyptic scenarios, in the popular Islamic apocalyptic scenarios, the Mahdi rules from Jerusalem for a little over 3 years. So they really don't want it irradiated. I don't think they would want it irradiated, but there's still that possibility. And it might take a few extraneous conventional explosives or maybe a nuclear suitcase in Europe, but I'm not even sure that it would take that because I think the Europeans would pretty much fold by that time. So that may be a little too much, even for our adversaries. In Japan, North Korea has been setting up these missile tests for a very long period of time. We've been not really ignoring them, but we haven't really worried about them that much. We keep saying this is just a test, or they may or may not launch. Well, Japan's very worried about it. And in this case, our adversaries are using it as their part of the deal. So Australia, this is a bit too much, I think, for Australia. But if you get the general idea, it's taking out the ports, and then maybe Alice Springs as a strategic objective. But Australia, again, the ports are the main part, and you really wouldn't need that much in the way of nuclear effects. You would probably be able to do that using conventional explosions. So all of these things going on, and the rest of the world is watching, maybe. This is where you might want to, if you could take this sound down. It's in a loop, I think. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. So now we have no electricity, no TV, no radio. Cars aren't starting. Cell phones don't work. Landlines may or may not work. Emergency generators are refusing to kick in the various locations, and water supplies have been limited or cut. We don't have any way of getting to work for our police, emergency personnel, and our military. Some of them can perhaps get in on foot if they're lucky, if they live closely. Panic at this point because it's Christmas Day, because most people have off. And most people don't necessarily go out early. They probably haven't tried to start their cars. So at this point in time, on a Christmas Day, panic is pretty much limited. They figure it's just another power outage. But it may not be. Now at this point in the original scenario, I actually spoke about the Mahdi and Ahmadinejad making an announcement in the Middle East saying the Mahdi had returned. This is actually a scenario that is postulated throughout the Middle East. As a matter of fact, in popular apocalyptic scenarios that come from Iran, actually, they have discussions over satellites failing, all electricity stopping, and all power coming to an end in the world, all electric power. It seems a bit odd to think that the Quran would address such things, but it is addressed in popular apocalyptic stories in the Middle East. So anyway, what happens as time passes? Again, it's hard to tell what would happen in the United States. Would they wait 6 months until we're all pretty much starving to death and weakened to attack? Or would they attack right away? Maybe a few cities on the ports? They probably would, I think, but I'm not positive. They could also wait a year until most of us have died, and then it wouldn't really matter. But sometime or another, we might see major explosions. We might not, but we would probably see societal chaos and breakdown that's been discussed already. Could this be done? In this particular scenario, we're talking about a coalition of anti-American forces to include Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela probably, maybe some Latin American dictators thrown into the bunch, but certainly human smugglers, weapons smugglers, and drug lords, as well as the gang elements. Alternatively, a single nation could possibly do such a thing. At least they could take us out, if not the rest of the world, the Western world. And again, this is the coalition that I'm discussing. We're talking about terrorist proxies in the United States, which would probably be mostly the Middle Eastern terrorist proxies of Iran, but it does include the Iranian, the IRGC, who have been trained with the MS-13 gangs in Venezuela to act as if they were Hispanic in order to cross the border and blend in with society. We know that to be happening right now. So what we'd like you to do really is keep asking yourself. You might have a lot of doubts right now, but keep asking yourself, could this happen? I think it could. I could be wrong. How could we prevent it? And maybe really the way of keeping it from happening at all, as has been said, that's the only way that we can survive, is keeping it from happening to begin with. And are there any questions? I think we have a couple minutes.
The reactor page that shows what happened when the power went down. Can you help? I guess explain it. It seems like if that happens, that the electricity being off wouldn't necessarily be it'd be the cause of the bigger problem. But that seems to be a much bigger issue. I mean, we don't have power, but then everyone's going to be, having like 3 heads or whatever.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but
I guess it seems like if someone's going to attack us, knowing that that's going to happen, I mean, what would be left if there's like nuclear fallout from the reactors? What's left?
You mean what would they care? How would they?
Because it seems like more of that would be, by doing the EMP, it seems it would cripple, but what would be left here if there was nuclear fallout the way your map showed it? Or am I not understanding what happens at the reactors?
Well, the West would be left. If we're talking about an Islamic enemy,
Yeah.
they consider virtually anything to be possible because Allah would will it. And if Allah doesn't want them to have a problem in living with the land, in other words, they would be immune to the radiation. If they wanted that land, they would be immune. Others may not care one way or another. If they could take over the West Coast and they'd be fine.
And that's kind of what I was getting to. It seems like, it's not necessarily someone's going to attack us to like either conquer us or something, that it would just be to more or less destroy us versus trying to conquer us, I guess. That's kind of where I was going.
Actually, the purpose would be to take us out
as
an actor on the world stage instantaneously. And if you're talking about an Islamic enemy, which to a large extent this is focused with Russia and China going through Iran as a proxy. The main focus is Israel, but you have to take us out first.
I'd like to add to that in terms of the object and purpose. If one could explore that a little bit more, one of the issues the EMP Commission raised is that an adversary might just want the capability to do this, so they can threaten to do this, like North Korea, Russia, Iran, or whatever, because knowing that we are so vulnerable, that would basically neutralize us. It could neutralize us as an actor on the world stage without them even doing it, actually having to carry through a threat. Now, some nations like Iran, for example, for ideological reasons, or North Korea, because of psychosis, might do it anyway, because their ideology demands it, because their mental state, as Kim Jong-un was threatening us with a nuclear strike just last year. But perhaps more sophisticated powers would want the capability so that they could basically eliminate us as a superpower. It's basically achieving what the Soviet Union had struggled to achieve all through the Cold War, to overawe us, and intimidate us with nuclear superiority, but that now achieved, because they could do that. Because we would have to calculate, well, what kind of price are we willing to pay? How much risks are we willing to run? Look at the situation in Ukraine. For instance, I mean, it's a small, well, maybe it's not a small example. I mean, it's a country the size of France. But we did sign a treaty, under the Clinton administration, that was supposed to guarantee their security. It turns out under the Vienna Convention of Law Treaties, it's not binding, so we don't have to go to war for them. But the impression was created worldwide, that we were going to protect their security. Yet our calculus, and nobody's even threatened us with an EMP attack, right? But our calculus about the risks of going into Ukraine, that's too heavy a lift for us. We don't want to do that. So, that's an example of how the United States can be neutralized, even with threats that are lesser than this. But imagine if you could have that in your control, and you could threaten us with basically this kind of an existential threat. So it's a danger, even if they don't pull it off. Just the geopolitical implications of having this capability. Yet, if we are able to protect ourselves, if we can say to ourselves, and our political leaders can say, and people living at the state level, and Americans are aware that we are protected, that threat from Kim Jong-un to do an EMP attack that's going to take us down as a society, hey, we've protected our grid. Moreover, we have perhaps followed Ambassador Cooper's advice and put some Aegis interceptors, beefed up our national missile defense a little bit. So we've got interceptors that we can take out of the South. Then that threat becomes non-credible. And we're not eliminated as a superpower at very low cost, and it takes off the table, the greatest threat that the adversary can use against us.
Cynthia, you mentioned actually in a couple of slides, you talked about, or you mentioned risk management, basically being a recipe for disaster. Can you just explain that? You didn't go into an explanation of why. I was just curious where that came from and why, explain why that would.
Well, actually, this study explains it much better than I ever will be able to.
That a Dixon study.
It's a Berlin study, as a matter of fact. It's essentially, if we eliminate the outliers, then we're eliminating worst case. And business logic being trying to take care of that which is most feasible. When you're looking at something that's a high impact, low frequency event, it's probably not something that's going to stay on your radar because it's low frequency. When would it ever happen? It's not something people want to prepare for because they don't see it as happening 2 years, 5 years down the road. That's really the way I see it. That risk management has been adapted to the extent that we no longer will think about preparing for worst case types of things or high impact, low frequency events. Yes.
Cindy, just a little minor issue. Under your scenario, after a major attack, foreign armies landing on our shore or embedded forces, would they be under the same disadvantage that you were under that came here?
It depends. If they came afterward, they wouldn't be. If most of our adversaries are hardened and they're preparing for these kinds of things, especially if they know that they're going to initiate an attack and stuff, they would know how to have a landing force that wouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing. What they would have to worry about is a lot of Americans with guns, and that's been discussed in Russia, for instance. But if we have, all they really have to do is wait for a while, because we'll run out of ammo, we'll run out of resolve, and we'll certainly run out of food. I might add that the people that we know that are waiting in the United States for a trigger event have prepared already. They have resources available to them. They have prepared. They've stockpiled food. They've stockpiled weapons. And
That's exactly the scenario that Titus and the Jewish Roman War implemented to let the Jews destroy themselves.
Transportation, you're saying engines don't start. How remedial? What are we talking about to repair those engines? Is this something that's quick, or is this just going to stop all transportation?
well, actually, I'll let Dr. Hyde address it. It's been
Well, all automobiles, it depends on the scenario, we were talking about. If we're talking about an actual EMP, okay, from the sun. That's not going to affect automobiles because they're too small. The wavelengths for E3 are so large that they need a large antenna to connect into something like power lines, communications cables, pipelines, railroad tracks, and things like that. However, in 72 hours, as a consequence of the national blackout, though, you won't get gas, just like a normal blackout. The gas pumps won't work. You won't be able to deliver. So in 72 hours, basically, when the car runs out of gas, even if it's not fried electronically, it's not going to be of any use to you under that scenario. Under the nuclear EMP scenario, yeah, it can come with your car and destroy it. That depends on the design characteristics of the weapon. If it's a super EMP weapon, it's likely that all the transportation, or most of it, is going to be fried and it's going to stop, including airplanes, cars, and that sort of thing. Even under those circumstances, there's going to be some surviving automobiles. For example, cars that might be parked in underground parking garages would be protected if it's parked in a metal garage by accident. Even if it's protected by the shadow of a building that's parked close enough to a wall, just by accident, some small number of cars will survive. But then again, the car is useless when you don't have any gasoline, to put in it. Remediating, it would be difficult to go back once the thing is fried. As I will talk about in my afternoon discussion, though, there are things you can do to protect even a modern automobile. I think the material cost would be less than $100. You could protect an automobile with a fire truck or a police car, from even a super EMP weapon, or at least mitigate the effects so that it would greatly increase the likelihood that the car itself would survive.
Any others? I thank you very much.
Thank you, Cindy. Okay, we have worked our way towards lunch. We're going to have a working lunch. So what we would like you to do, there's just a really nice loop that you can make and go out that door, through the kitchen,